Frederick West was born on the 29th of September 1941 in the rural village of Much Marcle, Herefordshire, England. He was the first surviving child of Walter West, a milking herdsman and harvest hand, and Daisy Hill, a deeply protective and doting mother. By all accounts, the West household was ordinary. They were a poor, close-knit family of farm laborers. In 1946, the growing family relocated to Moorcourt Cottage, a semi-detached structure adjacent to Moorcourt Farm on the outskirts of Much Marcle, where Walter worked. The home had no electricity and was heated solely by a log fire. By 1951, Daisy had given birth to 8 children, 6 of whom survived infancy. Fred was always his mother's undisputed favorite. Classmates and neighbors described him as a mother's boy, shy and reliant mostly on his siblings for company rather than outside friends. Despite the family's poverty, the West children were expected to pull their weight. All 6 surviving children performed daily chores and seasonal labor. The 3 girls picked hops and strawberries, while the 3 boys, including Fred, harvested wheat and hunted rabbits. This upbringing instilled a genuine aptitude for manual work in Fred, but it also cultivated a lifelong habit of petty theft, a pattern that would escalate alongside far darker behaviors. At school, he was remembered rather poorly by his classmates. They later described him as scruffy, dim, lethargic, and always getting into trouble. Academically, he was basically illiterate, testing at the reading level of a 7-year-old, and could barely understand basic mathematics. The one area where he displayed genuine talent was in woodwork and artwork, skills that would later serve him in construction, which would play a crucial role down the line. He left school in December 1956 with no qualifications at the age of 15, going to work immediately alongside his father as a farm laborer at Moorcourt Farm and a neighboring property. In later years, Fred made extensive claims about the dysfunction within his childhood home. He alleged that his mother, Daisy, had begun exploiting him at the age of 12. He further claimed that his father, Walter, frequently made troubling advancements on his daughters. Furthermore, Walter allegedly introduced Fred to disturbing behavior involving animals. By 1957, Fred and his brother John began regularly visiting a youth club in the nearby town of Ledbury. Fred's thick Herefordshire accent immediately marked him as a country bumpkin to the other young people. He showed no interest in building genuine relationships. Instead, he aggressively pestered and fondled women at every opportunity, treating them as objects of pleasure to be used as he saw fit. On the occasions when a girl accepted his advances, she typically found the experience deeply unsatisfying, as Fred's sole focus was his own gratification. Then came 2 events that, according to multiple researchers and forensic psychologists, may have fundamentally altered Fred's brain and behavior. In November 1958, at the age of 17, Fred was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. The crash fractured his skull, broke his arm and leg, and left him unconscious for 7 consecutive days. A metal plate was surgically placed in his head. Following his recovery, his family noticed pronounced changes in his personality. He became prone to sudden, uncontrollable fits of rage. He also developed an extreme and lasting fear of hospitals. Prior to the accident, Fred had been troublesome but not outwardly violent in a way that alarmed those around him. Afterward, something had shifted. 2 years later, around 1960, he suffered a second significant head injury. While at the Ledbury Youth Club, he groped a girl standing on a fire escape. She punched him in the face, and the blow sent Fred tumbling 2 full stories to the ground. Fred was arrested, and his response to police questioning was startling. He freely admitted to officers that he had been victims since his early teens. When pressed on whether he understood the gravity of what he had done, he sincerely asked, "Doesn't everybody else do it too?" Fred was tried on the 9th of November 1961 at Herefordshire Assizes. However, immediately before she was scheduled to testify, Kitty changed her mind and refused to take the stand. The case collapsed. Fred's defense team had cited his head injuries as the root cause of his behavior, arguing that the motorcycle accident and the fire escape fall had impaired his judgment and impulse control. He was convicted of the lesser charge of child molestation and avoided any prison sentence. The fallout within the West family was severe, at least temporarily. Daisy, though disgusted by Fred's actions, had been prepared to testify in her son's defense. Much of the wider family effectively disowned Fred after the trial. His mother banished him from the family home, and he was forced to move in with his Aunt Violet and Uncle Ernie at Daisy Cottage in Much Marcle. By mid-1962, Fred had reconciled with his parents, but his relationships with most of his siblings remained permanently fractured. In September 1962, the 21-year-old Fred became reacquainted with a woman he had first met at a dance hall 2 years earlier. Her name was Reena Costello. Reena was a Scottish girl from Coatbridge, Lanarkshire, with a troubled background of her own. She had a police record for burglary and prostitution. At the time of their reunion, Reena was pregnant by a Pakistani bus driver, and it is believed she had relocated from Glasgow to England in part because her family disapproved of her carrying a mixed-race child. Fred and Reena married about 2 months after reuniting. The ceremony was sparse. The sole guest was Fred's younger brother John, who served as best man. The newlyweds initially lived with Fred's aunt before relocating to Coatbridge, Scotland, where Fred found work as an ice cream van driver. Reena's daughter, Charmaine Mary, was born on March 22, 1963. To conceal Charmaine's mixed-race parentage, Fred and Reena told people they had adopted the child and that Reena had suffered a miscarriage. Shortly after, the couple moved to Savoy Street in the Bridgeton district of Glasgow. In July 1964, Reena gave birth to Fred's biological daughter, Anna Marie. A family nanny named Issa McNeil, along with neighbors, later recalled Reena as a considerate and caring mother who was struggling to bring up 2 children. Fred, by contrast, treated the girls with open cruelty. He kept Charmaine and Anna Marie confined in the bottom bunk of a bunk bed with bars fitted across the space between the bunks, effectively caging the toddlers. They were allowed out only when Fred was at work. Fred's job as an ice cream van driver in Glasgow provided him with steady, unsupervised access to young teenagers. The full extent of his offending during this period has never been established, but it was clear that his work was meant to serve as a means to seek out vulnerable victims. Furthermore, Reena shared that Fred had increasingly extreme and bizarre demands. He pressured her relentlessly, and as their marriage deteriorated, he began encouraging her to work as a prostitute to supplement his meager income. He also began physically abusing Charmaine. On one occasion, a man named John McLaughlin, with whom Reena was having an affair, witnessed Charmaine approach Fred's ice cream van and innocently ask for an ice cream. In response, Fred struck the small child across the head. McLaughlin later said any ordinary man would have given the child some ice cream, but instead he smashed her round the head with his hand. He was a violent and sadistic bastard who enjoyed beating up women and kids. McLaughlin and Reena had begun their affair after she grew tired of Fred's infidelity and violence. On one occasion, Fred discovered the pair together and punched Reena, causing her to scream. McLaughlin punched Fred in return, at which point Fred drew a knife and grazed McLaughlin's abdomen. When McLaughlin hit him a second time, Fred stopped defending himself entirely. McLaughlin's later assessment of Fred said the following: "He couldn't tackle a man, but he wasn't so slow in attacking women. Every time McLaughlin noticed fresh bruises or black eyes on Reena, he beat Fred in retaliation, but it changed nothing. The violence against Reena and the children continued. On November 4th, 1965, Fred accidentally struck and killed a young boy while driving his ice cream van through the streets of Glasgow. He was cleared of any criminal wrongdoing by police, but the incident terrified him. He feared retribution from the local community, which could lead to the loss of his income entirely. Within weeks, he fled Glasgow, taking Charmaine and Anna Marie with him and leaving Reena behind. He rented a caravan at the Timberland Caravan Park in Bishop's Cleeve, near Cheltenham, Gloucestershire. Reena followed him south in February 1966, accompanied by Issa McNeil and a young woman named Anne McFall. McFall was just 16 years old when she joined the household. She and McNeil both came from impoverished backgrounds in Scotland and hoped to find better opportunities in England. All 3 women moved into Fred's cramped caravan. Shortly after the move, Fred found employment driving a lorry for a local slaughterhouse. According to officials, Fred's work at the slaughterhouse may have served as a catalyst for his already developing obsession with death, mutilation, and the dismemberment of bodies. He spent his working days surrounded by the methodical cutting apart of animal carcasses, and this exposure may have lowered whatever psychological barriers might have still existed between violent fantasy and action. By early 1966, he had established a pattern of dominance and control over all 3 women living in his caravan. His mood swings were violent and unpredictable, and Reena and McNeil bore the worst of his fury. He also began brutalizing Charmaine around this time, all the while continuing to pressure Reena into prostitution. Desperate to escape, Reena phoned McLaughlin in Glasgow and begged him to come rescue her, McNeil, and the children. Together, they devised a plan. McLaughlin and McNeil's boyfriend, John Trotter, would secretly drive to Bishop's Cleeve in McLaughlin's car and take the women and children back to Scotland. The plan failed. McFall, who had by this point become infatuated with Fred and believed he would eventually divorce Reena and marry her, alerted Fred to the scheme. When McLaughlin and Trotter arrived at the designated meeting time, Fred was already there. McFall appeared oddly calm as she informed McNeil that she intended to stay with Fred as the children's nanny. A physical altercation erupted between Fred and McLaughlin, with Fred clinging to both Charmaine and Anna Marie as McLaughlin struck him. Police were called, and McLaughlin, Trotter, McNeil, and Reena departed. As they left, Fred threatened to kill Reena if he ever saw her again. Despite this terrifying threat, Reena continued to make periodic trips to England to visit her daughters. Her instincts as a mother kept pulling her back, even as common sense urged her to stay away. Anne McFall, now 18 and still living with Fred at the caravan park, had become deeply attached to him. Letters she sent home to her family and to Issa McNeil between 1966 and 1967 revealed a young woman who genuinely believed a relationship with Fred could give her a better life than the poverty she had known all her life. She tried repeatedly to persuade Fred to divorce Reena and marry her. By July 1967, McFall was 8 months pregnant with Fred's child. Her pressure on Fred to formalize their relationship had intensified. For Fred, this was intolerable. He had no intention of being constrained by any woman's expectations. Instead of responding to McFall's pleas, he killed her. McFall was never reported missing. Her disappearance went entirely unnoticed. It was not until June 1994, 27 years later, that her dismembered remains were found, buried at the edge of a cornfield between Muchmarcle and Kempley, close to where Fred had grown up. Her limbs had been carefully separated at the joints with precision. Many of her finger bones were missing entirely, believed to have been retained by Fred as keepsakes or trophies, and her unborn child may have been cut from her womb. When Fred was confronted about the killing decades later, he told a visitor that he had stabbed McFall to death following an argument. But this explanation was inconsistent with the physical evidence. Her wrists had sections of dressing gown cord wrapped around them, strongly suggesting that she had been restrained before she was murdered. Within 6 months of McFall's murder, another young woman vanished from the Gloucester area. On January 6, 1968, 15-year-old Mary Bastholm was abducted from a bus stop. She was a waitress at the Clean Plate Cafe in the city and, by all accounts, seemed like a bright and well-liked teenager. Fred has long been the primary suspect in her disappearance, but only circumstantial evidence has ever linked him to the case. During his police interviews in 1994, Fred reportedly confessed to Mary's murder on multiple occasions to his son, Stephen, and to detectives, but subsequently retracted those statements. Mary has never been recovered, and her case remains officially unsolved. If Fred was indeed responsible, she represents the earliest example of his pattern of targeting young women at bus stops, a hunting ground he and his future partner in crime would return to repeatedly in the years to come. If all of this chaos and depravity in one man was not enough, Fred would soon meet an equally disturbed woman named Rose. In early 1969, at a bus stop in Cheltenham, the 27-year-old Fred struck up a conversation with 15-year-old Rosemary Pauline Letts. Rose's initial reaction to Fred was repulsion. She looked at the scruffy, gap-toothed man in unwashed clothes and assumed he was a homeless man. But Fred was persistent. Over the following days, he made a point of appearing at the same bus stop and sitting beside her, showering her with attention and charm. Rose twice refused to go on a date with him, but she allowed him to walk her home. He quickly identified what made Rose vulnerable. Learning that she worked at a nearby bread shop, he persuaded an unknown woman to enter the shop and present Rose with a gift, along with a message that a man outside had asked her to deliver it. Minutes later, Fred entered the shop himself and asked Rose to go on a date. She accepted. In their early conversations, Fred extracted sympathy from Rose by claiming that he and his 2 daughters had been abandoned by his wife and that he desperately wanted more children. He also discovered to his delight that although Rose had never had a boyfriend, she was highly promiscuous. Within weeks, Rose left her job at the bread shop to become the full-time nanny to Charmaine and Anna Marie at Fred's caravan. The arrangement required Fred to give Rose enough money to hand to her parents on Fridays so they would believe she was still earning a salary. Initially, Rose treated the girls with genuine care and affection. She and Fred took the children on outings such as flower picking, but this would not last. When Rose introduced Fred to her family, the reaction was explosive. Rose's mother, coincidentally also named Daisy, was unimpressed by Fred's bragging and quickly identified him as a pathological liar. Her father, Bill, vehemently disapproved of the relationship. On an interesting and disturbing side note, Bill himself was a diagnosed schizophrenic who was believed to have abused Rose. He threatened Fred directly and promised to contact social services if the relationship continued. Bill and Daisy followed through on this threat, visiting social services to report that their daughter was involved with the much older Fred West. At the same time, there were rumors developing of Rose soliciting her body from Fred's caravan. In response, Rose was placed in a residential home for troubled teenagers in August 1969, permitted to leave only under supervised conditions. But whenever Rose was allowed home for weekend visits, she used the opportunity to see Fred instead. On her 16th birthday in November 1969, Rose left the care home and returned to her parents' house. Fred was serving a 30-day sentence for theft and unpaid fines at the time. Upon his release, Rose abandoned her parents' home entirely and moved in with Fred at his Cheltenham flat. Fred collected Charmaine and Anna Marie from social services, and the 4 of them began living together. Bill made one final effort to separate his daughter from Fred. Rose was examined by a police surgeon in February 1970 who confirmed she was pregnant. She was placed into care once more, but was discharged on March 6th on the understanding that she would terminate the pregnancy and return to her family. She did neither. Instead, Rose went straight back to Fred, prompting her father to permanently forbid her from setting foot in his house again. 3 months later, the couple moved into the ground floor of a 2-story house at 25 Midland Road, Gloucester. On October 17, 1970, Rose gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Heather Ann. In December 1970, Fred was imprisoned again, this time for the theft of car tires and a vehicle tax disc. He remained incarcerated until June 1971. During this time, 17-year-old Rose was left alone with 3 small children: Charmaine, age 8, Anna Marie, age 6, and the infant Heather. The pressure of this responsibility, combined with her own deep-seated psychological issues, unleashed something savage in Rose. According to Anna Marie's later testimony, both she and Charmaine were subjected to relentless criticism, beatings, and punishment throughout the months Rose cared for them. Anna Marie was generally submissive, prone to tears, and silently complied. Charmaine was the opposite. Despite years of neglect and abuse stretching back to Fred's caging of the girls in Glasgow, Charmaine's spirit had never been broken. She refused to cry, no matter how severely Rose beat her. She displayed no grief and refused to submit. And she repeatedly antagonized Rose, which deeply struck her insecurity of not being in control or dominant. Hospital records from Gloucester Royal Hospital documented that on March 28, 1971, Charmaine was treated for a severe puncture wound to her left ankle. Rose explained it away as a household accident. Sadly, Rose is believed to have murdered Charmaine shortly before Fred's prison release date of June 24, 1971. The last confirmed sighting of Charmaine alive was on June 15th of that same year when Rose brought all 3 children to visit Fred in prison. It is believed to be on or very shortly after this date that Charmaine was killed. Forensic odontology analysis confirmed that Charmaine had died while Fred was still incarcerated. Additional testimony from Tracy Giles's mother, Shirley, corroborated the timeline. Shirley stated that after her family had vacated the upper flat at Midland Road in April 1971, she brought Tracy to visit Charmaine one day in June. Rose answered the door and said she's gone to live with her mother and bloody good riddance. In response, Tracy began to cry. The precise circumstances of the murder have never been established. What is known is that Rose hid Charmaine's body in the coal cellar of the Midland Road flat, where it remained until Fred's release. To others who inquired about Charmaine's whereabouts, Rose offered a consistent cover story. She would say that Reena had called and taken her eldest daughter to live with her in Bristol. She also informed staff at Charmaine's primary school that the child had moved with her mother to London. When Fred was released from prison, he took over the disposal of the body. He buried Charmaine's remains in the yard close to the back door of the flat. Fred maintained throughout his life that he had not dismembered Charmaine, though a subsequent autopsy revealed the body had been severed at the hip. Several of her bones were also missing from her skeleton, primarily finger, wrist, ankle, and toe bones. When Anna Marie asked where her sister had gone, Fred told her that Reena had come to collect Charmaine and taken her back to Scotland. Anna Marie, confused and hurt, asked why her mother had taken Charmaine but not her. Fred gave her a callous response. He said, "She wouldn't want you, love. You're the wrong color." As mentioned before, throughout this entire turbulent period, Reena attempted to keep in touch with Fred so that she could speak to her daughters. In the latter half of August 1971, she visited the West family home to inquire about her children's welfare. Fred's sister-in-law, Christine, later recalled that Reena appeared deeply depressed and extremely anxious. Christine provided Reena with Fred's Midland Road address, and Reena went to confront him to demand custody of her daughters. This was the last time Reena was seen alive. She is believed to have been murdered by strangulation, possibly in the backseat of Fred's Ford, and likely while she was intoxicated. A short length of metal tubing was found with her remains, raising the possibility that she had been restrained and subjected to a sexual assault prior to being killed. Fred extensively dismembered Reena's body, placed the pieces into plastic bags, and buried them close to a cluster of trees known as Yew Tree Coppice at Letterbox Field. This was the same remote area where Anne McFall had been interred 4 years earlier. Fred and Rose's shared knowledge of each other's crimes bound them together in a unique way. Neither could expose the other without destroying themselves. On January 29, 1972, the two married at Gloucester Register Office. Several months later, with Rose pregnant with their second child, the couple left the flat at Midland Road and relocated to a 3-story house at 25 Cromwell Street, situated close to Gloucester City Centre. Over time, he purchased it outright for about £7,000. On June 1, 1972, Rose gave birth to their second daughter. The date of the child's birth prompted Fred and Rose to name her May June. In this new house, Fred and Rose would construct a world designed entirely around their appetites for sexual domination, exploitation, and violence. Over the next 2 decades, 25 Cromwell Street would become the site of at least 9 murders, countless assaults, and a place of terror on the West's own children. Fred became a compulsive renovator, perpetually modifying the structure of the home. The ground floor was reserved exclusively for Fred, Rose, and their family. To maintain this separation, Fred installed a cooker and wash basin on the first floor landing so that lodgers renting rooms upstairs would have no reason to enter the family's living space. The upper floors were converted into bedsits for renting to help fund the mortgage and Fred's endless renovation projects. Only the West family was permitted access to the back garden, which sat behind the house and was enclosed by walls and fencing, shielded from the view of neighbors. The cellar was the most critical space in the entire property. Accessed via a trapdoor, it was a dark, damp, foul-smelling underground chamber that Fred converted into what investigators would later describe as a torture chamber. He carved holes into the wooden beams that supported the cellar ceiling. Holes he later admitted to police he had designed specifically for the purpose of suspending his victims' bodies during prolonged assaults. The cellar was far enough below street level and sufficiently insulated by the house's thick Victorian walls that screams from within were unlikely to reach the outside. The side entrance to the property, which provided access to the cellar without passing through the main house, opened onto a quiet lane that allowed for discreet movement in and out of the building. Shortly after the birth of May June in 1972, Rose began working as a prostitute from within the house itself. Fred not only encouraged this arrangement, but he also actively facilitated it. He placed advertisements in local contact magazines on Rose's behalf, specifically targeting clients from Gloucester's West Indian community. Rose used the working name Mandy, and the upstairs room from which she operated became known throughout the household as Mandy's room. Fred drilled hidden peepholes in the walls of the room so he could watch Rose with her clients from adjacent spaces. He also installed a baby monitor in the room, allowing him to listen to the sessions from elsewhere in the house when he was unable to watch directly. The room itself contained a private bar for entertaining clients, and a red light was mounted outside the door to signal when Rose was not to be disturbed. Rose carried the only key to the room on a chain around her neck. Fred also installed an additional doorbell on the exterior of the house, which Rose's clients were instructed to ring upon arrival. Much of the income generated from this avenue was funneled directly back into home renovations. However, Rose also engaged in casual sex with both male and female lodgers of their home. She also slept with people Fred encountered through his work, and with strangers she and Fred picked up together. She openly bragged that no single man or woman could fully satisfy her. When engaging in her encounters with women, Rose exhibited escalating brutality. She partially suffocated her partners, inserting increasingly large objects into their bodies, and grew aroused when her partner resisted or expressed pain or fear. By 1983, Rose had given birth to 8 children, at least 3 of whom had been fathered by her clients rather than Fred. Fred accepted all of these children as his own without question. When the children, who were visibly of mixed race, asked why their skin was darker than that of their siblings, Fred explained it away by claiming that his great-grandmother had been a black woman. Shockingly, by 1977, Rose's father, Bill, had come to tolerate and even grudgingly respect his son-in-law. Together, he and Fred opened a small cafe they named the Green Lantern, which quickly proved to be a terrible decision. More disturbingly, when Bill discovered that his daughter was working as a prostitute, he became one of her regular clients, visiting her home to sleep with Rose. When each of the West children reached the age of 7, they were assigned extensive daily chores within the household. They were seldom permitted to socialize outside the home unless Fred or Rose was physically present, and they lived under a rigid set of rules, which were met with physical punishment if disobeyed. The children feared both parents, but Rose was by far the more prolific and unpredictable source of violence. She beat the family frequently, often irrationally, just for her own gratification. But she always took care not to leave marks on faces or hands where bruising would be visible to outsiders. On one occasion, one of the couple's sons, named Stephen, was mopping the kitchen floor when Rose accidentally stepped into the bucket of water he was using. In response, Rose struck the boy over the head with the bowl, then repeatedly kicked him in the head and chest while screaming, "You did that on purpose, you little swine." On another occasion, she became enraged about a missing kitchen utensil. She grabbed a knife she had been using to slice a cut of meat and repeatedly drew the blade across May June's chest until her ribcage was covered in light knife wounds. Throughout the attack, May screamed for her mother to stop, while the other children stood by, sobbing helplessly and unable to intervene. Even Fred was occasionally on the receiving end of Rose's violence. In August 1974, Rose chased him through the house, wielding a carving knife. Fred managed to slam a door shut just as Rose lunged at him with the blade. The knife embedded itself in the door, and Rose's own fingers slid down the blade, nearly severing 3 of them from her hand. Both Heather and Stephen, the 2 eldest biological children, ran away from home at different points during their childhoods. Both returned after several weeks, realizing that leaving was unsustainable, and both were beaten severely upon their return. Between 1972 and 1992, the West children were admitted to the casualty departments of local hospitals 31 times. Every injury was explained as an accident. Not once were these visits reported to Child Protection Services. Another greatly tragic incident occurred in September 1972, shortly after the family moved on to Cromwell Street. Fred and Rose led 8-year-old Anna Marie down to the cellar. Fred and Rose gave her commands, but when she hesitated, Rose grabbed her dress and tore it from her body. Anna Marie was then bound to a mattress and gagged. Fred raped her while Rose stood nearby, actively encouraging him. After the incident, Rose followed the traumatized Anna Marie to the bathroom and handed her a sanitary towel. She then offered what she apparently considered reassurance, saying, "I'm sorry, everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job. Don't worry and don't say anything to anybody." Fred and Rose then made it clear that these assaults would continue, and they threatened Anna Marie with severe beatings if she ever disclosed what they had done to her. On one occasion, when Anna Marie was 13 or 14, Rose took her to a local pub and insisted she drink several glasses of barley wine over the course of several hours. When Fred arrived to collect them, Anna Marie was bundled into his van and beaten by Rose before being assaulted by both her father and stepmother. One of the first documented incidents involving an outsider occurred in October 1972. The West encountered 17-year-old Caroline Owens on a secluded country road as she hitchhiked from Tewksbury, where her boyfriend lived, to her home in Cinderford. During the journey, she confided in Fred and Rose about her difficult home life. She had a strained relationship with her stepfather and was looking for employment to gain financial independence. Fred and Rose jumped on her vulnerability immediately. They offered her a part-time position as a nanny to their 3 children, with the promise that she would be driven home every Tuesday. It seemed like an ideal opportunity. Several days later, Caroline moved into the couple's home, where she was assigned to share a bedroom with Anna Marie. She noticed immediately that the 8-year-old was rather withdrawn. Caroline's initial impressions of the household quickly soured. She noticed a steady stream of men visiting the house and asked Rose about it. Rose casually explained that she worked as a masseuse, an explanation Caroline accepted at face value, at least initially, but other details accumulated that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Fred talked about romantic situations almost incessantly. He boasted to Caroline that he was skilled at performing abortions and claimed that many of the women he had performed these procedures on were so grateful that they would offer him romantic favors as payment. Both Fred and Rose began directing overt sexual advances toward Caroline. Their comments became more explicit, and they began to initiate more physical contact. Caroline, deeply unsettled, announced her intention to leave and return home. The Wests went ahead and allowed her to leave. However, they had formulated a plan to abduct Caroline before she could truly escape. Fred also stated that a secondary purpose of Caroline's abduction was to test whether Rose would be a willing participant in kidnapping and assault. On the evening of December 6, 1972, Fred and Rose drove along the A40 between a route they knew Caroline regularly hitchhiked. They spotted her and pulled over, offering her a lift home. Their demeanor was warm and apologetic. They expressed regret for their earlier behavior and assured Caroline that she had simply misunderstood their intentions. Caroline believed them and climbed into the car. Rose joined Caroline in the back seat, explaining that she wanted to have a girls' chat while Fred drove. For a few minutes, the conversation was normal. Then Rose began to fondle Caroline. Simultaneously, Fred began asking her whether she had slept with her boyfriend that evening. Caroline screamed and tried to push Rose away. Rose grinned and laughed, refusing to stop. On the outskirts of Gloucester, Fred abruptly stopped the car, turned around, and punched Caroline in the face with enough force to knock her unconscious. When she regained consciousness, she found herself bound and gagged. Her hands were tied behind her back with her own scarf, and tape had been wrapped around her head, covering her mouth and tangled into her hair. Rose was sitting on top of her in the back seat, pinning her down and talking and laughing as though nothing unusual was happening. The 3 drove back home, and what followed was approximately 12 hours of sustained assault and torture. At one point during the ordeal, one of the West children knocked on the door of the room where Caroline was being held. Caroline screamed for help. This enraged Fred. He grabbed her by the throat, pushed his face into hers, and said the following: "We're going to keep you in the cellar and let our black friends use you, and when we finished with you, we're going to kill you and bury you under the paving stones of Gloucester. There are hundreds of girls there. Police haven't found them, and they aren't going to find you." Fred then claimed that he had killed hundreds of girls before. He also told Caroline that she had been brought to the house primarily for Rose. In a strange turn of events, after Fred finished his assault, he began to cry. He apologized for what he had done and said, "Please don't tell Rose. If she finds out, she'll kill you and me." It was a bizarre and manipulative attempt to position himself as a subordinate victim of his own wife's cruelty. The following morning, the atmosphere in the house shifted abruptly. Fred and Rose, as though a switch had been flipped, became calm and conversational. They sat Caroline down and asked whether she would consider returning to work as their nanny. Caroline, terrified but understanding rejection likely meant her death, agreed. Later that day, Rose took Caroline to a nearby laundrette. Once inside, Caroline seized her opportunity and fled, making her way home to Cinderford. When she arrived home, Caroline was initially too ashamed to tell her mother what had happened, but when her mother noticed the welts, bruises, and exposed tissue, she demanded to know what had occurred. Caroline broke down in tears and told her everything. Caroline's mother immediately contacted the police, and Fred and Rose were arrested and faced with multiple charges. It was the most serious set of charges the West had ever faced, and it should have been the end of their crimes. The case was tried at Gloucester Magistrates Court on January 12, 1973, but by the date of the trial, Caroline had decided she could not face the ordeal of testifying in open court. She was young, traumatized, and deeply ashamed. The prospect of recounting the graphic details of her assault in a public courtroom in front of the very people who had attacked her was more than she could bear. Without her testimony, the prosecution's case collapsed. All charges were dropped. Fred and Rose agreed to plead guilty to the reduced charges of indecent assault and causing bodily harm, lesser offenses that carried no prison sentence. They were each fined £50 and were allowed to return home. When Caroline learned the outcome of the trial, she attempted to take her own life. In this next portion, I'm going to cut down on the details drastically, as it could very well go on for around an hour. But from 1973 to 1979, following the trial, the couple continued to carry out their sadistic crimes, eventually escalating to actual murder. Victims were gagged with their mouths completely wrapped in adhesive and surgical tape, with small tubes inserted into their nasal cavities so they could continue breathing during the ordeal. Oftentimes, they were suspended from the previously mentioned holes that were carved into the ceiling beams. Afterward, Fred dismembered the bodies, carefully disarticulating the limbs. Finger and toe bones were routinely missing from the remains, believed to have been taken as trophies. The bodies were subsequently buried in shallow graves in the cellar or garden of the property. The first victim was 19-year-old Linda Goff in April 1973. She was a lodger who had engaged in intimate relationships with other tenants in the house. After her murder, her mother visited Cromwell Street and found Rose wearing Linda's clothes and slippers. Rose casually told her that Linda had moved out to find work. The next victim was 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper. She was abducted from a bus stop after visiting a cinema with her boyfriend. Her skull was found bound with surgical tape, and her dismembered limbs were wrapped with cord and braiding cloth. The third victim was Lucy Partington, aged 21. She was an Exeter University student and the cousin of novelist Martin Amis. She vanished while waiting for a bus in December 1973. Then in April of 1974, Therese Siegenthaler, also aged 21, was abducted when hitchhiking from South London to Holyhead. Fred mistook her Swiss accent for Dutch and always referred to her as the Dutch girl or Tulip. A scarf tied in a bow around her gag was later described by prosecutors as having a distinctly feminine quality, suggesting Rose's involvement. In November of that same year, 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard was abducted from a bus stop near River Severn. Her head had been completely wrapped in tape, with a narrow rubber tube inserted 3 inches into her nasal cavity. In April 1975, 18-year-old Juanita Mott was abducted while hitchhiking. However, it was stated she was also a former lodger of Fred and Rose's residence. After her murder, Fred concreted over the entire cellar floor, sealing the graves of 6 victims beneath what he would later convert into a bedroom for his children. 3 years later, in May 1978, Shirley Robinson, aged 18, began lodging at the couple's residence. At some point, she voluntarily began engaging in intimate activities with both Fred and Rose. She became pregnant with Fred's child, and her presence began to threaten the stability of the Wests' marriage. Rose, who was herself pregnant at the time, grew deeply resentful. Robinson was murdered and buried in the garden. What makes her murder slightly different is that no restraints were found with her remains, suggesting that her death was purely territorial. Fred later confessed that Rose had personally murdered Robinson and removed the unborn baby from her womb after death. The next victim was 16-year-old Allison Chambers, who died in August 1979. She was a runaway from a children's home and became a live-in nanny for the Wests. Rose had promised her she could live at a peaceful farm the couple supposedly owned. After her murder, the Wests posted a letter Allison had previously written to her mother, mailing it from a different address to maintain the illusion she was still alive. The Wests' last confirmed murder was that of their own 16-year-old daughter, Heather Ann West, on June 19, 1987. Heather had endured years of assault from her from both parents. When she began telling a friend about what was happening at home, the Wests viewed her as an existential threat. Her body was buried under the patio in the back garden. Their son Stephen, then a teenager, was forced to help dig the hole. The other West children were told Heather had simply left home to work at a holiday camp in Devon. The Wests even fabricated a phone call, supposedly from Heather, to quiet their other children's suspicions. Most infamously, Fred weaponized Heather's disappearance as a threat, telling his children, "If you don't behave, you'll end up under the patio like Heather." What was intended as intimidation would ultimately become the thread that unraveled everything. The investigation that ended the Wests' terror began in August 1992, when Fred was arrested for the assault of his 13-year-old daughter, Louise. Rose was also arrested. Detective Constable Hazel Savage led the initial search of the couple's home, finding adult material and substantial evidence of child abuse. However, the case collapsed when the key witness, their daughter, refused to testify, and charges were dropped in June 1993. The Wests' 5 youngest children were placed into foster care, and it was while in care that they mentioned what they described as a family joke. The joke was the previously mentioned threat about ending up under the patio like Heather. This dark remark was enough for Savage, who had long harbored suspicions about the family, to push for a search warrant. On February 24, 1994, police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street with a warrant to excavate the garden. Fred initially confessed to killing Heather, attempting to take sole responsibility and shield Rose. But as the digging revealed more and more remains, Fred was pressured into confessing further. He eventually wrote a handwritten note to his solicitor admitting to a further 9 killings. The excavation ultimately uncovered the remains of 9 victims at Cromwell Street. The remains of Charmaine were found at their former Midland Road flat, and the remains of Ann McFall and Reena were discovered in fields near the city of Fred's family. Fred was charged with 12 counts of murder in December 1994. Throughout over 108 hours of recorded police interviews, he repeatedly changed his story, sometimes confessing, sometimes denying everything, but consistently attempted to portray Rose as innocent. On January 1st, 1995, before he could stand trial, Fred took his life in his cell at HM Prison Birmingham using knotted bed sheets. He was 53 years old. Rose West went on trial at Winchester Crown Court on October 3rd, 1995, charged with 10 counts of murder. Against her legal team's advice, Rose took the stand in her own defense. Her testimony was inconsistent and often jarring. She wept while describing herself as a victim of domestic abuse, but then laughed while describing a victim's appearance and joked about always being pregnant. She claimed to have never met 6 of the victims and to recall very little of the assault on Caroline Owens. When shown photographs of the victims and asked if she recognized their faces, her face turned bright red and she stammered repeatedly, "No, sir." The prosecution's most damaging rebuttal witness was Janet Leach, Fred's assigned appropriate adult, which is basically someone who assists vulnerable adults during police interviews. Leach testified that Fred had privately confessed to her that he and Rose had formed a pact the night before his arrest, agreeing that he would take sole blame for all the murders. Fred had described many of the killings as some of Rose's mistakes, and told Leach that Rose had played a major part in the murders. On November 22, 1995, after 7 weeks of evidence, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts on all 10 counts of murder. Rose was sentenced to life imprisonment. Her sentence was later confirmed as a whole life tariff by Home Secretary Jack Straw in 1997, meaning she will die in prison with no possibility of parole. Rose launched appeals in 1996 and 2000, both of which were rejected. In 2001, she abandoned all further appeals, though she continues to maintain her innocence. While 12 murders have been confirmed, many believe the true number of victims is higher. During his interviews, Fred made cryptic references to additional victims, telling Janet Leach there were up to 20 further victims buried in scattered locations, and that he intended to reveal the location of one body per year to investigators. His death ensured those claims could never be verified. Rose West, now 72 years old, remains incarcerated at HM Prison New Hall in West Yorkshire. She was transferred there in 2019 from Low Newton, reportedly after fellow serial killer Joanna Dennehy threatened to kill her. She has still never acknowledged responsibility for any of the murders.